Hey everyone, so let's say you're looking to build a budget gaming PC. Now, traditional wisdom says that you kind of need to buy both CPU and GPU, and until recently, if we're looking at the low end, I'd say something like an Intel Pentium G4560 paired with an Nvidia GT 1030 would be the way forward. But then AMD dropped this bomb, the Ryzen 3 2200G, a $99 APU that combines a quad-core Ryzen CPU and Radeon Vega graphics. Now, if you've watched my stuff in the past, you'll know that I love budget PC hardware, and this Ryzen is exceptionally cool. There's just nothing like it on the market at the moment. So allow me to demonstrate what the big deal is. First up, there's the cost. So yeah, this $99 product is almost $50 cheaper than that Pentium GT 1030 combo. Secondly, it is ridiculously easy to overclock, and as long as you're sensible, you don't actually need to replace the supplied stock cooler. Quick look at some specs then. 3.5 GHz clock speeds, 3.7 GHz turbo, 8 compute units at 1100 MHz for about 1.12 teraflops of GPU compute. So we've got AMD's review kit here, the Gigabyte GA-AB350N Mini ITX board. Now, the 2200G is in situ there with the stock cooler. Oh, and what's this? G-Skill Flare X, rated for 3200 MHz with super low CL14 latency. AMD has supplied this high-end RAM because APUs work best with fast memory. Unfortunately, it's also expensive memory. I'm using it for the benchmarks here, but for my gameplay demos later on, I'm slowing this RAM down so it's equivalent to something that's actually a bit more affordable. Regardless though, here are some quick benchmarks. Grand Theft Auto 5 then, 3 measurements here. 1080p, high settings, well, you get superb visuals here and decent frame rates too, funnily enough. The green line here represents stock performance with the Flare X modules running fully enabled, and it's essentially delivering a 15% boost in performance over the same processor running at the same settings but paired with slower 2400 MHz DDR4. However, keep the fast RAM and overclock the GPU to 1500 MHz, and we actually get a 19% improvement to performance over stock settings. And yes, I really was running this on the stock cooler with no problems whatsoever. Another interesting result here with Cry Primal running at 1080p on medium settings. The stock 2200G with fully enabled DDR4 here only offers a 6.3% uplift over the same processor running with slower memory. However, with our overclock in place, performance actually increases by around 28%. Pretty amazing stuff, and remember that this overclock is entirely free. As for The Witcher 3, well, in the taxing Novigrad City area, truth is that 1080p medium is pushing things somewhat, but faster memory at stock offers a 12.6% performance uplift. Once again, the overclock is the star of the show here, a 21% increase over stock with that faster memory. But yeah, those frame rates, sort of early to late 20s, not great, right? Well, one route forward is of course to use a lower resolution. So here's Rise of the Tomb Raider showing scaling at 1080p, 900p and 720p. Dropping from 1080 to 900 boosts performance by 30%. If you can take the jumbo pixels, reducing res from 1080p to 720p increases frame rates by around 80%, so that's something to bear in mind. Now, a lot of games have internal resolution scalers in their menu systems that retain a 1080p video output and keep the HUD at native resolution, upscaling the 3D elements only. And for an APU, this is well worth playing with. Okay, so these 1080p benchmarks aren't hugely compelling perhaps, but the point is that we can actually run any game we throw at it. And that's a start. I mean, I bought in a Core i3-8100, which is more expensive than the 2200G here. And as you can see, when the games do actually boot, performance is generally abysmal. So there's genuine potential here with the 2200G, especially if we overclock. So with that in mind, I actually spent a day playing games as opposed to just benchmarking them, and there are some pretty good results. So let's kick off with Destiny 2, a game that we know scales well to less capable hardware. 1080p resolution here with a mixture of low, medium and high settings. I've set the BIOS on the Gigabyte board to allot 2 gigs of memory to the GPU and this is perfectly fine for the game's highest quality textures. Resolution scale, 100%, so yes, this is native 1080p. Now personally, I'd be playing this one with the game's 30 FPS lock in place, but I've left it unlocked so we can get an idea of overhead. The game is looking pretty awesome actually, and we're north of 30 FPS for the most part. Sometimes we're getting a bit close to the threshold, and occasionally, yes, we do dip beneath. You can see this here with the bandwidth sapping supercharged effects here. We drop beneath that target 30 FPS threshold momentarily while that mode is in place. And yeah, when the game is running at its absolute peak, we can also see some further drops beneath our frame rate target here. But this is the game at its most demanding, and tweaks to the resolution scaler can help to mitigate some of these issues if they prove particularly bothersome. But hang on a moment. With Ryzen, we actually have the CPU power to run Destiny 2 at 60 frames per second. So what does it take to get that silky smooth frame rate from the APU? Well, I tried the resolution scaler set to 67% first of all, which essentially offers up a 720p internal resolution. But yeah, not good enough. As it happens, 50% hit the target on the same settings as my 1080p gameplay. So yeah, 540p effectively, quarter resolution. Mostly it's 60 frames per second, but there are still some hiccups here and there. But this kind of illustrates the harsh trades you will face with AAA gaming on an integrated graphics solution. But moving on, well, holy crap, Titanfall 2 is awesome. Let's kick off here with the campaign. 60 frames per second and it's locked. And while it's obviously not the full fat visual experience, it still looks pretty good. Most of the post-process pipeline is intact. I can use texture settings reserved for 3 gig cards, and the dynamic resolution scaler keeps me locked at 60. Now Destiny won't let me run Reaver Tuner monitoring, but every other game, no problem. So up there in the top right, we have the GPU and memory frequency. That confirms 1.5 gigahertz on the GPU and memory at 1500 megahertz. Well, this should be doubled for its real-life bandwidth, so this does indeed confirm 3000 megahertz frequencies in play. Beneath that, well, we have the CPU load per core, and under that, the frame rate. Let's talk settings. We've got Titanfall 2 here running on a mixture of medium and low settings. Ambient occlusion is off, but some elements I've left on high. Now, dynamic resolution can look a bit iffy at times, but I've tried to mitigate that with 8 times anisotropic filtering. I've set the FPS target to 68 FPS here to give overhead and to ensure the game stays locked at 60. And you know what? It does, and it plays beautifully. So far we've seen campaign action that is fairly demanding, but I was concerned about memory bandwidth issues. Titan on Titan action with screen-filling explosions will obviously be a bit more challenging, so I gave that a shot as well. Curiously, at the beginning of the campaign mission here, there was a touch of stutter, but as we get into the actual action, well, that 60 frames per second remains locked, and I'd say that this is a pretty amazing turnout for a $99 processor, and I do recommend checking it out. 60 FPS then, 60 frames per second, it's a prime requisite for Overwatch, and with a bit of tweaking, once again the 2200G will do you proud. 1080p output, high textures, 8 times anisotropic filtering, low shadows, and everything else on medium effectively. Resolution scaling is not 1080p however, I'm on 75% here, which is 810p basically. Still looks pretty decent overall, but I do kind of wish that the console's dynamic scaler could be in play here. Regardless, we've got a nice looking experience here, and with a title like this, frame rate is king and a locked 60 is key. Okay, so from here on out, we're really going to challenge the 2200G. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, PUBG, yes, we're going there. I mean, this game is hardly optimal. It's no Destiny 2 or Titanfall 2 in that regard. I sort of went in thinking that if we were at Xbox One quality levels and performance, we've probably got a pretty decent result there. Well, Xbox One is a mixture of very low, and possibly medium settings. I've started out here with 1080p output on medium settings, high textures, but low shadows. The opening descent is ropey, just as it is on Xbox. But even wandering about with not much going on gives us frame rates in the mid-20s. So if I drop the screen scale to 90%, that gives us a 1728 by 972 internal resolution. Still looks okay. Performance improves, but we're still dipping beneath 30 at times. Not good. So let's move that resolution scaler to 83%, which takes us to a 900p internal resolution. Things aren't brilliant, but the worst frame rates have improved. But yeah, 900p, perhaps not ideal. However, PUBG runs on Unreal Engine 4, which actually has a superb temporal anti-aliasing solution. And I think I have enough overhead available to move anti-aliasing up to high, which will tidy up image quality a bit. I mean, it's not a great experience, but this is a demanding game, and by and large, the 2200G is holding up. One further area we should possibly tweak: foliage. On scenes with a ton of it, once again we're having some sub 30 FPS issues. Regardless though, this game running on a $99 processor with no discrete graphics card, well, I'm impressed. So I wondered just how far I could push it. Rise of the Tomb Raider. Yeah, this is one taxing game. 900p resolution is a must here, and I'm running with VSync with triple buffering so that performance hit with VSync engaged won't be so bad. Settings, high textures, yes, I'm going there, and pretty much everything else on medium with 4 times anisotropic filtering. Pure hair, I have turned that off though. That's a lot of compute power dedicated to a pretty small amount of screen real estate. So let's push things hard straight away with the geothermal valley. Now, the hub areas in Tomb Raider are the most challenging in the game, and yes, there are still some dips beneath 30 frames per second. Are they GPU related though? Well, if you look at the CPU measurements in the top right there, you'll see that we're close to maxed at 30 frames per second, no less. So why is this? Well, remember that memory bandwidth is hugely important to an APU, and it's shared between both the CPU and GPU components. Now, if that bandwidth could be allocated to the CPU alone with a discrete GPU in place, you'd see a vast increase in performance from the CPU side. To illustrate, here's the 2200G and indeed the competing Core i3 8100 paired with an overclocked Titan X Pascal running the same content at very high settings. Now, the 8100 is faster, and it's faster running on slower memory, no less. 2400 MHz RAM is its limit, or rather it will be when Intel gets its act together with cheaper boards. But the point is that the Ryzen 3 2200G CPU is clearly capable of a lot more when it doesn't have memory bandwidth contention with the GPU. In fact, we're looking at almost twice the performance level. But returning to our APU gameplay tests, if the geothermal valley is one of the more demanding areas, the Prophet's Tomb is somewhat lighter for the most part, and it holds up pretty well. Cutscenes can cause some issues, but I'm not particularly fussed about that. It's kind of alright with me when the player isn't in control. Overall though, we're staying north of 30 FPS in gameplay for the most part, and that's pretty cool. Massive screen-filling water effects once again cause a memory bandwidth bottleneck, and yes, performance will drop here. But, you know, by and large, this really demanding game is still perfectly playable. What I'd really like to see though is driver level 30 FPS support with proper frame pacing here. Something I did talk about with the AMD driver team when I met up with them a little while back. And this kind of functionality would be a crucial addition for this APU. Now, we saw some Witcher benchmarks earlier on that were a bit, well, let's say suboptimal. Mid-20s at 1080p isn't great. I targeted 900p on a mixture of medium and high, with the settings reductions aimed at the sort of stuff likely to affect memory bandwidth. Our Novigrad City test run runs fairly well, but drops to a 27 frames per second minimum. The cutscenes before you take on the Griffin here look beautiful and generally stay north of 30, which isn't bad at all with all that foliage in place. However, once we factor in bandwidth sapping effects like fire, yeah, things don't really hold up. Same for depth of field really. So yeah, maybe we were a bit too ambitious with settings there, even at 900p. But it illustrates that there are games that thrive on memory bandwidth that this APU, and indeed any APU, will have issues with. I'm going to end this with a really cool experience though. Again, at the top of this video I showed a GTA 5 benchmark, and it was pretty cool. Some really decent results there. I initially started out with these settings, a mixture of high and normal with very high textures. The VRAM meter at the top there gives me some idea of how to spend the budget, but I've actually set the internal scaler to render at 900p effective. And my question, could we hit 60 frames per second? On an APU, that would be really sweet. Well, as you can see here, I mean, it's okay, late 40s to mid 50s, but we don't quite have the horsepower to get the job done. So what if we went in the other direction and targeted 1080p native and started to ramp up the settings? So let's climb into this helicopter and really put the engine through its paces with some extreme draw distances. Well, you know what? It's holding up and it looks good. Sort of 45 FPS no man's land though, so I put shadows up to high and matched that with the same settings for ambient occlusion and tessellation. Mid-30s to early 40s now, but the visual feature set is looking really solid. GTA 5 does have a 30 FPS cap, but it's a bit rubbish. Frame pacing is poor, and again, an AMD driver level 30 FPS mode with a locked 33 millisecond frame persistence would do a world of good here. Fingers crossed that this does eventually happen for AMD users, as it is a really useful feature on NVIDIA hardware. Okay, so a couple of final questions I had. Can our overclocked 2200G really deliver discrete level GPU performance? And can it actually handle any AAA game? Well, on the latter point, Assassin's Creed Unity shows that some games will just be too much. Now, possibly at 720p you'll get something playable, but really, its demands are just too much. You'll note that the GT 1030, even paired with the faster Ryzen 5 2400G, is only marginally ahead. Crysis 3, well, the benchmark shows the GT 1030 screaming ahead here, but I tried 900p on medium with the APU, and there seems to be a real issue with this game. On areas with far out detail and tons of draw calls, the 2200G absolutely tanks. Turn around though, suddenly everything's fine. Kinda weird. Cry Primal's benchmark does show the overclocked 2200G drawing level with the GT 1030 though, which is interesting. The bottom line though is that there will be scenarios where the 2200G offers entry-level discrete performance, but equally, well, you'll need fast RAM to do so, and even then you're going to struggle in games that really do need decent amounts of memory bandwidth, as we saw in Destiny 2 and The Witcher 3. Now, if only every game could have a dynamic scaling system as good as Titanfall 2's. Okay, so that's all from me for now. I really enjoyed my testing with the 2200G, and I was really impressed with the results from this $99 processor. And AMD's decision not to have a bespoke socket requiring a dedicated motherboard for APUs really pays off here. The same system will happily house a high-end Ryzen CPU and whatever discrete GPU you care to upgrade with later on down the road. That's a massive plus point in my book, a game changer you might say. Anyway, as always, do like and subscribe to support our work, and consider supporting the Digital Foundry Patreon if you value what we do and want to help out. And of course, you get pristine quality video downloads for your contribution too. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.